Welcome to World Gone Weird, discussing what the heck is going on in the world today.
All right, everyone, buckle up because things are still pretty weird. I mean, if anything, it's getting weirder.
Yeah, it's like the dial got cranked up to 11 and then someone just, snapped the knob off.
Definitely, it's hard to even know where to start sometimes. There's so much happening.
Well, I guess a place to start is with the news about the ceasefire in Gaza. It's complicated to say the least. It was supposed to start, 8:30 a.m. their time, and then it got delayed.
Right, a delay of almost 3 hours. And apparently, that was because Hamas hadn't handed over the list of the first 3 hostages to be released. I mean, it's a pretty fundamental step, you would think.
It does make you wonder about the communication channels or perhaps the internal coordination. I mean, attributing it to technical field reasons just feels dismissive, almost like a deliberate tactic.
Yeah, technical field reasons. I was thinking about that, and how often we use that kind of language to gloss over, fundamental breakdowns in communication. I wonder if a mindfulness-based approach, even on a small scale, could have helped. If instead of getting bogged down in the technical, they focused on the emotions and the underlying human needs of the situation, would have things been different?
That's interesting. It's like in a workout when I focus too much on the numbers and the reps, I get all tense and stressed. But if I tune into my body and how I'm feeling, I can actually push harder and feel better. Maybe it's the same for something like this.
Absolutely, there's a parallel there. It's about shifting focus from the external pressures to the internal state. In CBT, we talk about cognitive distortions that often occur in high-stress situations and can cause breakdowns in communication. Like the all-or-nothing thinking. They focus so intently on the technicality of the list that they forget the broader goal of the ceasefire.
Yeah, the articles mention how Netanyahu was like, no list, no ceasefire. Very hardline. It doesn't really leave any room for negotiation, or even just simple human error. It just feels rigid. It's also like a power move, right? Like, I'm in control here.
It is. I mean, it makes me think about how this approach of demanding complete compliance before any movement forward can really create more tension. It's the same as with my own internal dialogue sometimes. If I demand perfection, I get so tense, and I can't move forward at all. It's about finding a gentle path towards a goal instead of forcing it.
And it's all connected. Like when I don't get enough sleep, I'm so much more likely to snap at someone or get really stressed about something minor. I mean, if these leaders and mediators aren't getting enough sleep or are constantly in a state of high stress, their decisions are going to be affected.
Absolutely. I mean, the sheer pressure of that negotiation, plus the pressure of the entire conflict, must be crazy. Add the high stakes with those lives hanging in the balance. It's a breeding ground for that us versus them mentality that Otto was mentioning. It reminds me a bit of high-pressure negotiations in business, where people get so focused on winning that they destroy any chance of a good outcome.
Yes, and it's a negative feedback loop, right? The more they treat it like a competition, the more the other side will react defensively, and on and on. It's like when I get stressed, my breathing gets shallow, and that makes me more stressed. And I'm trapped in the cycle until I consciously focus on my breath again and break the pattern.
That's a perfect analogy, Jesus. And it's a great illustration of how physiological responses impact cognitive patterns. When we're stressed, we often default to those rigid, unhelpful thought processes. There's a study that showed how specific CBT techniques like thought challenging can reduce cortisol levels, the stress hormone. So, if leaders actually had those CBT skills, it could potentially prevent them from falling into these traps in the first place.
It's all about getting your body into the right state to make better decisions, right? When I feel relaxed and well-rested, it's way easier to think clearly and problem solve. My workouts are more effective too. I was reading about how different sleep schedules impact the effectiveness of each workouts, and it's fascinating how connected everything is.
Yeah, and it's not just the leaders, right? The news reports mention that the Israeli military continued strikes even after the ceasefire was supposed to begin. I mean, at least 13 people were killed. It really underscores just how fragile the whole situation is.
It does. It's like an incredibly delicate balancing act. And that's what's so tough about it, isn't it? These aren't just negotiations over resources or territory. It's people's lives. These are human beings dealing with unimaginable trauma and loss. And all this technical stuff gets in the way.
The news reports also mention the political fallout from this. How some of the far-right ministers in Israel resigned over the ceasefire agreement. It's all just further complicating an already complex situation. Again, it shows a lack of flexibility, how their rigid ideologies are impacting their decision-making.
Right. And it's not just the politicians either. There are reports of people in Gaza celebrating the ceasefire, but then also armed Hamas fighters showing up at those celebrations. I mean, it's not a unified front. There are all these different factions with different goals. So many moving parts.
And then you have people trying to get back to their homes in Gaza, despite the destruction. I can't even imagine what that must be like. And even then, there's this fear of ongoing tank shelling. It's like a constant state of anxiety and hypervigilance.
Absolutely. The level of trauma and stress that everyone involved is experiencing is just unfathomable. It's like a constant activation of the fight-or-flight system, making it incredibly difficult for anyone to think clearly or engage in a healthy manner. It's no wonder so many people become stuck in these reactive cycles. It makes me wonder how meditation, especially loving-kindness meditations, might help to reduce some of this intensity. Not as a cure, but as a support.
That's a great point, Jesus. Loving kindness meditation, which is really about cultivating empathy and compassion, could be a tool to help them see beyond their immediate conflict and focus on common ground. It is, in a sense, an active cognitive reframing exercise, like a gentle way to challenge those entrenched thought patterns without forcing them.
It's also just so sad to see so many families displaced and trying to return to destroyed homes. The news mentioned that about 90% of Gaza's population has been displaced. That's just staggering. And on top of that, the article also mentions the massive infrastructure damage.
Right. And the health system is badly damaged too. It's like, even if the fighting stops, the recovery process is going to be so incredibly long and difficult. I was reading about trauma recovery and how incorporating targeted exercise and relaxation techniques can really help. But it's got to be so difficult with the living conditions they are in.
And the long-term psychological impact of the war, especially for children, that's incredibly worrying. It's the sort of thing that affects cognitive development and the ability to cope with stress for decades to come. We really need to think about how mental health support is prioritized in these crisis situations and how to better integrate it into recovery programs.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if there could be some kind of large-scale program that combines different types of healing modalities, like meditation, yoga, and cognitive-based techniques, to help the people of Gaza rebuild their lives. Maybe even the military personnel as well, on all sides of the conflict. I mean, everyone is impacted, even if in different ways.
And then there's the whole political aspect of all this too. Trump is taking credit for the ceasefire. Biden's team is taking credit too, for that matter. It's like it's become this game of political chess. It all feels so calculated.
It does, and it highlights the role that ego plays even in such critical situations. The need for recognition, the need to be seen as the one who solved the problem. It often gets in the way of actual progress. It is a very clear example of a cognitive bias that can impact even the highest levels of leadership in multiple nations.
And the reports about Trump's administration saying they'll support Israel if Hamas doesn't follow the ceasefire, it makes it feel like they are setting the stage for this to fall apart. I mean, it's just so conditional. There's no flexibility. No room for anything to go wrong, which, well, it's human nature for things to go wrong.
Exactly, it's like they're already anticipating the breakdown instead of working on the possibilities of its success. It reminds me how in my personal life, if I expect something to go badly, it almost certainly will. It is like a self-fulfilling prophecy. What if they were focused on cultivating a sense of hope, of long-term potential, instead of the potential for failure?
That's a crucial point, Jesus. They're framing the entire situation through the lens of distrust rather than possibility. And that's a classic example of a cognitive bias, confirmation bias, where they interpret everything to fit their existing beliefs, making it much more likely that the ceasefire will fail. It is a negative feedback loop again. It all points to the need to reframe the whole scenario.
And all of this is happening right before Trump's inauguration. The news talks about how he was pushing for a swift deal, threatening hell to pay if the hostages weren't released. It's this weird mix of diplomacy and aggression. Makes you wonder what to expect with him back in office.
Right? And all the while, there's so much focus on this one event. But what is the follow-up? The news mentions the potential for 600 trucks of aid daily. But the UN is saying that is just a start. It's like they focus on the immediate win and then move on. I'm more interested in the long term. How will they deal with the trauma, the health crises, the need to rebuild? I mean, that will need more consistency than a single deal.
Exactly, it's not enough to just address the immediate crisis. It needs a long-term commitment to care and healing. It's like with healthy eating, you know. It's not just about eating healthy for one meal. It's about building consistent habits over time. It also makes me think about mindful eating and how much we are disconnected from the food we consume and the process of eating. We rush through the act of eating, just like we rush through conflict.
And it's that long-term commitment that really needs a cognitive shift, a reframing of how they perceive the situation. It's going beyond the immediate crisis management into a long-term development plan to help these communities reestablish and create healthy lives and societies. It goes beyond a simple deal and into sustainable healing.
It's like they want the quick win and the news cycle to move on. The news reports say this ceasefire is supposed to be a 3-stage deal, and that negotiations for the second and third phases will begin in about 2 weeks. That's actually not that much time considering all the complexities involved and considering how difficult it was to even get to this point.
Exactly. It's like those quick fix exercise programs. They might have immediate results, but then without a long-term plan and consistency, they quickly unravel. The reports are filled with words like fragile and bumpy in relation to the ceasefire, which does not exactly build hope for long-term solutions. It is a pattern of quick fixes, which are never actually sustainable.
Yes, and the reliance on short-term solutions or quick fixes is another common cognitive distortion. It's that urgent need to solve the immediate problem while neglecting the deeper systemic issues. In CBT, we often try to shift people from those impulsive actions towards more sustainable, long-term solutions through self-reflection and action plans.
Yeah, it's about seeing it as a journey and not a destination. Like with meditation, there are times of stillness and calm, and times when the mind wanders. It is about learning to gently redirect and be present with what is, without judgment. It is a long-term effort, a practice of continual refinement.
Well, the article also notes how the war has impacted the Middle East as a whole, how Iran's axis of resistance has been wrecked, and how Hezbollah's military infrastructure has been destroyed. So I guess things will be different now. But different doesn't always mean better.
And it is so easy for the narrative to shift to winning or losing on all sides. I mean, the news reports about how Israel has faced outrage and isolation over the devastation in Gaza. It's like even when some positive step is made, people immediately begin to find a way to frame it into good versus bad, instead of just seeing it as an advancement towards a positive outcome.
That's another cognitive distortion, focusing on the win or lose framing. It's very limiting because it ignores all the complexities and nuances of the situation. It prevents individuals from finding compromises or solutions that would actually benefit everyone involved. It becomes an absolute with no possibility of middle ground.
Right. It completely eliminates the possibility of mutual benefit and the idea that both sides could work towards a win-win scenario. It's about reframing the whole conflict from a competition to a collaboration, much like how meditation promotes awareness of interconnectedness. When I am focusing on the interconnectedness of all living things, I get far less caught in the narrative of win or lose.
And the article also mentions that Netanyahu is facing an international criminal court arrest warrant for war crimes. It really paints a grim picture of the whole situation. There are no good guys or bad guys. It's all messy and complicated.
And it's all interconnected. One article also mentioned the increase in humanitarian aid, but you know that there are logistical challenges to getting all that aid to people. They've been through so much, and now they face the challenges of food distribution, lawlessness, and the rebuilding process. It's an overwhelming amount of work.
And that overwhelming feeling is something we often see in people when they are facing complex, challenging situations. That sense of being overwhelmed makes it much more difficult to see a path forward. It is so important to recognize this feeling so that we can actively use CBT techniques to reframe things into smaller, more achievable goals.
Yeah, breaking down the overwhelming task into smaller, more manageable steps. It is a very effective approach to dealing with stress and overwhelm. I've noticed that when I focus on the small, intentional steps, the larger goal becomes much less intimidating, and I can find the internal fortitude to keep moving forward. It's the same in meditation. I cannot meditate perfectly, but I can be present for a moment.
Yeah, it's like the news mentions that Israel released 90 Palestinian prisoners and that families gathered to meet them, but there was a delay in that too. There was a last-minute dispute over the names on the list. It's like even when they take a step forward, there's some other glitch in the system. It is a very chaotic system.
Exactly, and that chaotic nature of it just reinforces that feeling of instability and uncertainty. It highlights that constant need for cognitive restructuring. They need to develop skills to be adaptable in the face of constant change and also to recognize and regulate their emotional responses.
And it's so easy to feel like you have no control in situations like that. I think that's where sleep and exercise really help me. When I work out, I have a sense of purpose and capability. And when I get good sleep, everything feels more manageable. I try to incorporate relaxation techniques into my sleep routine, which makes me feel more prepared for the day. It's all about creating stability within the chaos.
That internal stability is so important, isn't it? When I cultivate that sense of calm and control through mindful practice, it makes me feel more able to navigate the external chaos with greater resilience. It also gives me a sense of self-compassion, which helps to soften the reactions.
That's exactly it. The internal sense of control or self-efficacy is really key to managing stress and anxiety. And CBT can actually help people develop that skill set. It empowers them to feel less like they are victims of circumstances and more able to actively engage and create positive changes in their lives, even when chaos feels overwhelming.
It just feels like there are so many overlapping things happening, so many layers to this whole situation. It is so hard to know where to even begin to try to fix anything.
And it's also tiring, like a constant high-intensity workout that never stops. You need rest and recovery. You need time to process everything that is happening. I'm curious about how these leaders manage their stress and maintain their focus. Are they taking the time for exercise, good sleep hygiene, and recovery? Or is it just this relentless cycle of decision-making and reactions?
I wonder that too. If they prioritize their own well-being, if they approach the situation with a sense of mindfulness and compassion for themselves, maybe they would be more able to find a path towards a sustainable resolution. I mean, it's the same when I am working on big projects in my life. When I slow down and focus on what I really need, the path becomes so much clearer.
And it is about creating space to shift from that reactive mindset to a proactive one. When you give yourself the space to consciously respond rather than just react, you can also approach these challenging situations with more clarity. CBT also works on that fundamental level of action and response so that you are more in control of how you participate in life, instead of just being a victim to it.
Well, it sounds like we all agree things are still incredibly weird and very complicated. But at the very least, we're all still talking about it, trying to make some sense of all of this. I guess that's something.
Yeah, and maybe if we all took more time to focus on our internal states, our sleep, our exercise, and overall well-being, we might be better equipped to handle the chaos of the world.
And if we could develop our cognitive flexibility and coping mechanisms, we'd be able to move through difficult situations with more grace, more effectively and more empathetically, I think.
Absolutely. And if we can practice mindfulness and cultivate empathy, maybe, just maybe, we could also see a ripple effect in the world around us. Thanks everyone for listening.